Bolsheviks, February Revolution, and Great War, 1903 to 1917. Although Marxism-Leninism was created after Vladimir Lenin's death by Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, continuing to be the official state ideology after de-Stalinization and of other communist states, the basis for elements of Marxism-Leninism predate this. The philosophy of Marxism-Leninism originated as the proactive political praxis of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in realizing political change in Tsarist Russia. Lenin's leadership transformed the Bolsheviks into the party's political vanguard, which was composed of professional revolutionaries who practiced democratic centralism to elect leaders and officers, as well as to determine policy through free discussion, then decisively realized through united action. The vanguardism of proactive, pragmatic commitment to achieving revolution was the Bolsheviks' advantage in outmaneuvering the liberal and conservative political parties who advocated social democracy without a practical plan of action for the Russian society they wished to govern. Leninism allowed the Bolshevik Party to assume command of the October Revolution in 1917. 12 years before the October Revolution in 1917, the Bolsheviks had failed to assume control of the February Revolution of 1905, 22nd of January 1905 to 16th of June 1907, because the centers of revolutionary action were too far apart for proper political coordination. To generate revolutionary momentum from the Tsarist army killings on Bloody Sunday, 22nd of January 1905, the Bolsheviks encouraged workers to use political violence in order to compel the bourgeois social classes, the nobility, the gentry, and the bourgeoisie, to join the proletarian revolution to overthrow the absolute monarchy of the Tsar of Russia. Most importantly, the experience of this revolution caused Lenin to conceive of the means of sponsoring socialist revolution through agitation, propaganda, and a well-organized, disciplined, and small political party. Despite secret police persecution by the Okhrana, Department for Protecting the Public Security and Order, émigré Bolsheviks returned to Russia to agitate, organize, and lead. But then they returned to exile when people's revolutionary fervor failed in 1907. The failure of the February Revolution exiled Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and anarchists such as the Black Guards from Russia. Membership in both the Bolshevik and Menshevik ranks diminished from 1907 to 1908, while the number of people taking part in strikes in 1907 was 26% of the figure during the year of the revolution of 1905, dropping to 6% in 1908 and 2% in 1910. The 1908 to 1917 period was one of disillusionment in the Bolshevik Party over Lenin's leadership, with members opposing him for scandals involving his expropriations and methods of raising money for the party. This political defeat was aggravated by Tsar Nicholas II's political reformations of imperial Russian government. In practice, the formalities of political participation, the electoral plurality of a multi-party system with the State Duma and the Russian Constitution of 1906 were the Tsar's piecemeal and cosmetic concessions to social progress because public office remained available only to the aristocracy, the gentry, and the bourgeoisie. These reforms resolved neither the illiteracy, the poverty, nor malnutrition of the peasant, underclass majority of imperial Russia. In Swiss exile, Lenin developed Marx's philosophy and extrapolated decolonization by colonial revolt as a reinforcement of proletarian revolution in Europe. In 1912, Lenin resolved a factional challenge to his ideological leadership of the RSDLP by the Forward Group in the party, usurping the All-Party Congress to transform the RSDLP into the Bolshevik Party. In the early 1910s, Lenin remained highly unpopular and was so unpopular amongst international socialist movement that by 1914 it considered censoring him. Unlike the European socialists who chose bellicose nationalism to anti-war internationalism, whose philosophical and political break was consequence of the internationalist defensist schism among socialists, October Revolution and Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922. In March 1917, the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II led to the Russian Provisional Government, March-July 1917, who then proclaimed the Russian Republic, September-November 1917. Later in the October Revolution, the Bolshevik seizure of power against the provisional government resulted in their establishment of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, 1907 to 1991. Yet parts of Russia remained occupied by the counter-revolutionary white movement of anti-communists who had united to form the White Army to fight the Russian Civil War, 1907 to 1922, against the Bolshevik government. Moreover, despite the White-Red Civil War, Russia remained a combatant in the Great War that the Bolsheviks had quit with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which then provoked the Allied intervention to the Russian Civil War by the armies of 17 countries, featuring Great Britain, France, Italy, the United States, and Imperial Japan. Elsewhere, the successful October Revolution in Russia had facilitated the German Revolution of 1918-1919 and revolutions and interventions in Hungary, 1918 to 1920, which produced the First Hungarian Republic and the Hungarian Soviet Republic. In Berlin, the German government, aided by Freikorps units, fought and defeated the Spartacist uprising, which began as a general strike. In Munich, the local Freikorps fought and defeated the Bavarian Soviet Republic. In Hungary, the disorganized workers who had proclaimed the Hungarian Soviet Republic were fought and defeated by the royal armies of the Kingdom of Romania and the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, as well as the army of the First Republic of Czechoslovakia. These communist forces were soon crushed by anti-communist forces, and attempts to create an international communist revolution failed. However, a successful revolution occurred in Asia when the Mongolian Revolution of 1921 established the Mongolian People's Republic, 1924 to 1992. The percentage of Bolshevik delegates in the All-Russian Congress of Soviets increased from 13% at the First Congress in July 1917 to 66% at the Fifth Congress in 1918. As promised to the Russian peoples in October 1917, the Bolsheviks quit Russia's participation in the Great War on the 3rd of March 1918. That same year, the Bolsheviks consolidated government power by expelling the Mensheviks, the socialist revolutionaries, and the left socialist revolutionaries from the Soviets. The Bolshevik government then established the Cheka, All-Russian Extraordinary Commission, secret police to eliminate anti-Bolshevik opposition in the country. Initially, there was strong opposition to the Bolshevik regime because they had not resolved the food shortages and material poverty of the Russian peoples as promised in October 1917. From that social discontent, the Cheka reported 118 uprisings, including the Kronstadt Rebellion, 7 to 17th March 1921. Against the economic austerity of the war communism imposed by the Bolsheviks. The principal obstacles to Russian economic development and modernization were great material poverty and the lack of modern technology, which were conditions that Orthodox Marxism considered unfavorable to communist revolution. Agricultural Russia was sufficiently developed for establishing capitalism, but it was insufficiently developed for establishing socialism. For Bolshevik Russia, the 1921 to 1924 period featured the simultaneous occurrence of economic recovery, famine, 1921 to 1922, and a financial crisis, 1924. By 1924, considerable economic progress had been achieved, and by 1926, the Bolshevik government had achieved economic production levels equal to Russia's production levels in 1913. Initial Bolshevik economic policies from 1917 to 1918 were cautious, with limited nationalizations of the means of production, which had been private property of the Russian aristocracy during the Tsarist monarchy. Lenin was immediately committed to avoid antagonizing the peasantry by making efforts to coax them away from the socialist revolutionaries, allowing a peasant takeover of nobles, estates, while no immediate nationalizations were enacted on peasants' property. The Decree on Land, 8th of November 1917, fulfilled Lenin's promised redistribution of Russia's arable land to the peasants, who reclaimed their farmlands from the aristocrats, ensuring the peasants' loyalty to the Bolshevik Party. To overcome the Civil War's economic interruptions, the policy of war communism, 1918 to 1921, a regulated market, State-controlled means of distribution and nationalization of large-scale farms was adopted to requisite and distribute grain in order to feed industrial workers in the cities, whilst the Red Army was fighting the White Army's attempted restoration of the Romanov dynasty as absolute monarchs of Russia. Moreover, the politically unpopular forced grain requisitions discouraged peasants from farming, resulted in reduced harvests and food shortages that provoked labor strikes and food riots. In the event, the Russian peoples created an economy of barter and black market to counter the Bolshevik government's voiding of the monetary economy. In 1921, the new economic policy restored some private enterprise to animate the Russian economy. As part of Lenin's pragmatic compromise with external financial interests in 1918, Bolshevik state capitalism temporarily returned 91% of industry to private ownership or trusts until the Soviet Russians learned the technology and the techniques required to operate and administrate industries. Importantly, Lenin declared that the development of socialism would not be able to be pursued in the manner originally thought by Marxists. A key aspect that affected the Bolshevik regime was the backward economic conditions in Russia that were considered unfavorable to orthodox Marxist theory of communist revolution. At the time, orthodox Marxists claimed that Russia was ripe for the development of capitalism, not yet for socialism. Lenin advocated the need of the development of a large corps of technical intelligentsia to assist the industrial development of Russia and advance the Marxist economic stages of development, as it had too few technical experts at the time. In that vein, Lenin explained it as follows: "Our poverty is so great that we cannot, at one stroke, restore full-scale factory, state socialist production." He added that the development of socialism would proceed according to the actual material and socio-economic conditions in Russia, and not as abstractly described by Marx for industrialized Europe in the 19th century. To overcome the lack of educated Russians who could operate and administrate industry, Lenin advocated the development of a technical intelligentsia who would propel the industrial development of Russia to self-sufficiency. Stalin's rise to power, 1922 to 1928. As he neared death after suffering strokes, Lenin's testament of December 1922 named Trotsky and Stalin as the most able men in the Central Committee, but he harshly criticized them. Lenin said that Stalin should be removed from being the general secretary of the party, and that he be replaced with some other person who is superior to Stalin only in one respect, namely in being more tolerant, more loyal, more polite, and more attentive to comrades. Upon his death on the 21st of January 1924, Lenin's political testament was read aloud to the Central Committee, who chose to ignore Lenin's ordered removal of Stalin as general secretary because enough members believed Stalin had been politically rehabilitated in 1923. Consequent to personally spiteful disputes about the praxis of Leninism, the October Revolution veterans Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev said that the true threat to the ideological integrity of the party was Trotsky, who was a personally charismatic political leader, as well as the commanding officer of the Red Army in the Russian Civil War and revolutionary partner of Lenin. To thwart Trotsky's likely election to head the party, Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev formed a troika that featured Stalin as general secretary, the de facto center of power in the party and the country. The direction of the party was decided in confrontations of politics and personality between Stalin's troika and Trotsky over which Marxist policy to pursue, either Trotsky's policy of permanent revolution or Stalin's policy of socialism in one country. Trotsky's permanent revolution advocated rapid industrialization, elimination of private farming, and having the Soviet Union promote the spread of communist revolution abroad. Stalin's socialism in one country stressed moderation and development of positive relations between the Soviet Union and other countries to increase trade and foreign investment. To politically isolate and oust Trotsky from the party, Stalin expediently advocated socialism in one country, a policy to which he was indifferent. In 1925, the 14th Congress of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, chose Stalin's policy, defeating Trotsky as a possible leader of the party and of the Soviet Union. In the 1925 to 1927 period, Stalin dissolved the Troika and disowned the centrist Kamenev and Zinoviev for an expedient alliance with the three most prominent leaders of the so-called right opposition, namely Alexei Rykov, Premier of Russia, 1924 to 1929, Premier of the Soviet Union, 1924 to 1930, Nikolai Bukharin, General Secretary of the Comintern, 1926 to 1929, Editor-in-Chief of Pravda, 1918 to 1929, and Mikhail Tomsky, Chairman of the All-Russian Central Council of Trade Unions in the 1920s. In 1927, the party endorsed Stalin's policy of socialism in one country as the Soviet Union's national policy and expelled the leftist Trotsky and the centrists Kamenev and Zinoviev from the Politburo. In 1929, Stalin politically controlled the party and the Soviet Union by way of deception and administrative acumen. In that time, Stalin's centralized socialism in one country regime had negatively associated Lenin's revolutionary Bolshevism with Stalinism, i.e., government by command policy to realize projects such as the rapid industrialization of cities and the collectivization of agriculture. Such Stalinism also subordinated the interests, political, national, and ideological, of Asian and European communist parties to the geopolitical interests of the Soviet Union. In the 1928 to 1932 period of the first five-year plan, Stalin effected the dekulakization of the farmlands of the Soviet Union, a politically radical dispossession of the kulak class of peasant landlords from the czarist social order of monarchy. As old Bolshevik revolutionaries, Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky recommended amelioration of the dekulakization to lessen the negative social impact in the relations between the Soviet peoples and the party, but Stalin took umbrage and then accused them of uncommunist philosophical deviations from Lenin and Marx. That implicit accusation of ideological deviationism licensed Stalin to accuse Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky of plotting against the party and the appearance of impropriety, then compelled the resignations of the old Bolsheviks from government and from the Politburo. Stalin then completed his political purging of the party by exiling Trotsky from the Soviet Union in 1929. Afterwards, the political opposition to the practical regime of Stalinism was denounced as Trotskyism, Bolshevik-Leninism, described as a deviation from Marxism-Leninism, the state ideology of the Soviet Union. Political developments in the Soviet Union included Stalin dismantling the remaining elements of democracy from the party by extending his control over its institutions and eliminating any possible rivals. The party's ranks grew in numbers, with the party modifying its organization to include more trade unions and factories. The ranks and files of the party were populated with members from the trade unions and the factories, whom Stalin controlled because there were no other old Bolsheviks to contradict Marxism-Leninism. In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union adopted the 1936 Soviet Constitution, which ended weighted voting preferences for workers, promulgated universal suffrage for every man and woman older than 18 years of age, and organized the Soviets, councils of workers, into two legislatures, namely the Soviet of the Union, representing electoral districts, and the Soviet of Nationalities, representing the ethnic groups of the country. By 1939, with the exception of Stalin himself, none of the original Bolsheviks of the October Revolution of 1917 remained in the party. Unquestioning loyalty to Stalin was expected by the regime of all citizens. Stalin exercised extensive personal control over the party and unleashed an unprecedented level of violence to eliminate any potential threat to his regime. While Stalin exercised major control over political initiatives, their implementation was in the control of localities, often with local leaders interpreting the policies in a way that served themselves best. This abuse of power by local leaders exacerbated the violent purges and terror campaigns carried out by Stalin against members of the party deemed to be traitors. With the Great Purge, 1936 to 1938, Stalin rid himself of internal enemies in the party and rid the Soviet Union of any alleged socially dangerous and counter-revolutionary person who might have offered legitimate political opposition to Marxism-Leninism. Stalin allowed the secret police NKVD, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, to rise above the law and the GPU, State Political Directorate, to use political violence to eliminate any person who might be a threat, whether real, potential, or imagined. As an administrator, Stalin governed the Soviet Union by controlling the formulation of national policy, but he delegated implementation to subordinate functionaries. Such freedom of action allowed local communist functionaries much discretion to interpret the intent of orders from Moscow, but this allowed their corruption. To Stalin, the correction of such abuses of authority and economic corruption were responsibility of the NKVD. In the 1937-1938 period, the NKVD arrested 1.5 million people, purged from every stratum of Soviet society and every rank and file of the party, of which 681,692 people were killed as enemies of the state. To provide manpower, manual, intellectual, and technical, to realize the construction of socialism in one country, the NKVD established the Gulag system of forced labor camps for regular criminals and political dissidents, for culturally insubordinate artists and politically incorrect intellectuals, and for homosexual people and religious anti-communists. Socialism in one country, 1928 to 1944. Beginning in 1928, Stalin's five-year plans for the national economy of the Soviet Union achieved the rapid industrialization, coal, iron and steel, electricity and petroleum, among others, and the collectivization of agriculture. It achieved 23.6% of collectivization within 2 years, 1930, and 98.0% of collectivization within 13 years, 1941. As the revolutionary vanguard, the Communist Party organized Russian society to realize rapid industrialization programs as defense against Western interference with socialism in Bolshevik Russia. The five-year plans were prepared in the 1920s whilst the Bolshevik government fought the internal Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922, and repelled the external Allied intervention to the Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1925. Vast industrialization was initiated mostly based with a focus on heavy industry. During the 1930s, the rapid industrialization of the country accelerated the Soviet people's sociological transition from poverty to relative plenty when politically illiterate peasants passed from czarist serfdom to self-determination and became politically aware urban citizens. The Marxist-Leninist economic regime modernized Russia from the illiterate, peasant society characteristic of monarchy to the literate, socialist society of educated farmers and industrial workers. Industrialization led to a massive urbanization in the country. Unemployment was virtually eliminated in the country during the 1930s. However, this rapid industrialization also resulted in the Soviet famine of 1930 to 1933 that killed millions. Social developments in the Soviet Union included the relinquishment of the relaxed social control and allowance of experimentation under Lenin to Stalin's promotion of a rigid and authoritarian society based upon discipline, mixing traditional Russian values with Stalin's interpretation of Marxism. Organized religion was repressed, especially minority religious groups. Education was transformed. Under Lenin, the education system allowed relaxed discipline in schools that became based upon Marxist theory. But Stalin reversed this in 1934 with a conservative approach taken with the reintroduction of formal learning, the use of examinations and grades, the assertion of full authority of the teacher, and the introduction of school uniforms. Art and culture became strictly regulated under the principles of socialist realism, and Russian traditions that Stalin admired were allowed to continue. Foreign policy in the Soviet Union from 1929 to 1941 resulted in substantial changes in the Soviet Union's approach to its foreign policy. In 1933, the Marxist-Leninist geopolitical perspective was that the Soviet Union was surrounded by capitalist and anti-communist enemies. As a result, the election of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party government in Germany initially caused the Soviet Union to sever diplomatic relations that had been established in the 1920s. In 1938, Stalin accommodated the Nazis and the anti-communist West by not defending Czechoslovakia, allowing Hitler's threat of preemptive war for the Sudetenland to annex the land and rescue the oppressed German peoples living in Czechia. To challenge Nazi Germany's bid for European empire and hegemony, Stalin promoted anti-fascist front organizations to encourage European socialists and Democrats to join the Soviet communists to fight throughout Nazi-occupied Europe, creating agreements with France to challenge Germany. After Germany and Britain signed the Munich Agreement, 29th of September 1938, which allowed the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, 1938 to 1945, Stalin adopted pro-German policies for the Soviet Union's dealings with Nazi Germany. In 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany agreed to the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 23rd of August 1939, and to jointly invade and partition Poland, by way of which Nazi Germany started the Second World War, 1st of September 1939. In the 1941 to 1942 period of the Great Patriotic War, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, 22nd of June 1941, was ineffectively opposed by the Red Army, who were poorly led, ill-trained, and under-equipped. As a result, they fought poorly and suffered great losses of soldiers, killed, wounded, and captured. The weakness of the Red Army was partly consequence of the Great Purge, 1936 to 1938. Of senior officers and career soldiers, whom Stalin considered politically unreliable. Strategically, the Wehrmacht's extensive and effective attack threatened the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union and the political integrity of Stalin's model of a communist state. When the Nazis were initially welcomed as liberators by the anti-communist and nationalist populations in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The anti-Soviet nationalists' collaboration with the Nazis lasted until the Schutzstaffel and the Einsatzgruppen began their Lebensraum killings of the Jewish populations, the local communists, the civil and community leaders. The Holocaust meant to realize the Nazi German colonization of Bolshevik Russia. In response, Stalin ordered the Red Army to fight a total war against the Germanic invaders who would exterminate Slavic Russia. Hitler's attack against the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany's erstwhile ally, realigned Stalin's political priorities, from the repression of internal enemies to the existential defense against external attack. The pragmatic Stalin then entered the Soviet Union to the Grand Alliance, a common front against the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. In the continental European countries occupied by the Axis powers, the native Communist Party usually led the armed resistance, guerrilla warfare, and urban guerrilla warfare against fascist military occupation. In Mediterranean Europe, the communist Yugoslav partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito, effectively resisted the German Nazi and Italian fascist occupation. In the 1943 to 1944 period, the Yugoslav partisans liberated territories with Red Army assistance and established the communist political authority that became the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. To end the Imperial Japanese occupation of China in continental Asia, Stalin ordered Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party to temporarily cease the Chinese Civil War, 1927 to 1949. Against Chiang Kai-shek and the anti-communist Kuomintang as the Second United Front in the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945. In 1943, the Red Army began to repel the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, especially at the Battle of Stalingrad, 23rd of August 1942 to 2nd of February 1943, and at the Battle of Kursk, 5th of July to the 23rd of August 1943. The Red Army then repelled the Nazi and fascist occupation armies from Eastern Europe until the Red Army decisively defeated Nazi Germany in the Berlin Strategic Offensive Operation, 16th of April to 2nd of May 1945. On concluding the Great Patriotic War, 1941 to 1945, the Soviet Union was a military superpower with a say in determining the geopolitical order of the world. Apart from the failed third period policy in the early 1930s, Marxist-Leninists played an important role in anti-fascist resistance movements, with the Soviet Union contributing to the Allied victory in World War II. In accordance with the three-power Yalta Agreement, 4 to 11th of February 1945, the Soviet Union purged native fascist collaborators and those in collaboration with the Axis powers from the Eastern European countries occupied by the Axis powers and installed native Marxist-Leninist governments.